This week, an immigration policy showdown in the House among GOP members. What, if anything, was decided about the Dreamers? The executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, Mark KRIKORIAN, joins us with an update. And the nuclear summit between the U.S. and North Korea is back on. Cato Institute foreign policy expert Doug BANDOW tells us what's at stake and what kind of deal may result. The Vatican issues formal guidelines on the right of so-called medically incurable children. Bioethics policy expert at Notre Dame, SNEAD, gives us his insights. And finally, we'll get story-oriented with New York Times best-selling children's author LIESL SHURTLIFF. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Mark KRIKORIAN, Doug BANDOW, SNEAD, and LIESL SHURTLIFF are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout the show. Now some news from the world over. House Republicans are once again looking to forge a consensus on an immigration deal. But after a closed-door meeting on Thursday, U.S. immigration reform appears to be going nowhere fast. Speaker Paul Ryan emerged from the meeting without any agreement, saying only that the conversation will continue within the caucus. Ryan said that the discharge petition, as it is called, is pointless since none of the bills being proposed could be passed. We'll get into what that means in a moment. The stalemate comes as Homeland Security announced that more than 50,000 border arrests were made in May for a third month in a row. The number is about triple compared to when President Trump first took office. Joining me now with an update on the GOP immigration debate and more is Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, Mark KRIKORIAN. Mark, thanks for being here.
Sure, happy.
So tell me, give our audience, without making their eyes glaze over, a discharge petition is something that 218 members can submit to the House, and it would allow a bouquet of bills to be considered, something called Queen of the Hill. Explain briefly what that means.
What the discharge petition means is that the 218 members can set the agenda for the House instead of the leadership, which is the way it usually works. So basically taking that control away. And the way they have it set up is that there would be 4 bills that would get voted on, and whichever one got the most votes.
Immigration bills.
Immigration bills, that's the whole point.
Right.
4 different ways of amnestying these DACA people and have other measures in it. Whichever one got the most votes, as long as it passed and got the most votes, would be the one that then is the one that's passed by the House.
So what happened is a group of moderate conservatives said, wait, we want to do something for these DACA kids now. The majority of the Republican caucus doesn't want to do anything because midterms are coming up.
Right.
So my question is, they're forcing the hand of the leadership. Paul Ryan met with his caucus. It looks like they're giving themselves a June 12th deadline to come up with some compromise. What might that look like?
Probably it would follow the outline of what the White House had tried to do several months ago. They called it 4 pillars. So the first thing is it would have some kind of legitimate amnesty for these so-called DACA people, and probably many more. We don't know how many this would be, how many would get amnestied. Second thing is that it would supposedly deal with some of the chain migration categories. Those are the ones where one immigrant comes in, gets citizenship, he gets to sponsor his relatives, and they sponsor their relatives, and it goes on and on forever. Third thing is the wall. The president insists on that, and if this is going to be a Republican bill, it's going to have an actual wall, not just fencing. And then the third thing is there's a bunch of loopholes and stuff in the law that are driving much of what we're seeing on the border now with these families coming over, because the rules the way they are now, if you have a kid with you, we basically have to let you go into the United States with a piece of paper saying, please show up, 2 years from now for court. So that's driving a lot of this. So the real question, though, is going to be, what are the details of those 4 elements?
Yeah. Well, you heard the report a moment ago. Nearly 52,000 migrants arrested at the border and in custody. This is a 3-fold increase from a year ago. What's happening? One thought that Trump's tough talk and the closing of loopholes and the tough arrests would deter people from coming. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, because some of that hasn't even happened. Congress has to do it. Some of it is relatively new. See, part of the reason the increase is so huge, because what we're really back to Obama-era levels of illegal immigration. It's just that last year, the levels collapsed because the president had just been inaugurated. A lot of people were like, well, let's wait and see. Smugglers said, let's hold off and see what's going on. Now they find out the president doesn't really have the power to stop them without congressional changes, and so it's going right back up. And most of these people are from Central America now, not Mexico anymore. Still a lot of Mexicans, but most are Central American, and a lot of them are people, either families with kids or so-called unaccompanied minors who aren't unaccompanied. Their smugglers bring them. And the rules as they are now means we can't hold any of those young people more than like a couple of weeks. If families bring them with them, we end up, under Obama, they would just let the adults go too, because the kids had to be let go.
Wow. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the separation of families. We keep hearing about that the president has a policy of separating families at the border as a means of deterrence. I want to play you this. This is Attorney General Jeff Sessions talking about it. Watch.
If people don't want to be separated from their children, they should not bring them with them. We've got to get this message out. You're not given immunity. You will be prosecuted if you come illegally, and if you bring children, you'll still be prosecuted.
And see, that's the key thing. The policy is not, oh, let's separate kids and that'll scare people away from doing it. The policy is you don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card just because you bring your kid with you. Under Obama, that was the case. People got the message, and they said, this is great. We're going to use our children as human shields against immigration enforcement. And what the Attorney General is saying is, not anymore. You're crossing the border illegally. That's a federal crime. We're going to prosecute you, and your kid doesn't go to jail. You're the one who goes to jail, so your kid is going to end up either in foster care, or if there are relatives to place him with, they do that. Yeah, that's why it's happening.
And that's the other part of this. These people are so urgently looking for a better way of life. Look, we've been to these countries. I've been to Central America, South America. Who wouldn't want to live in the United States, considering some of the very difficult circumstances these people live in, the poverty, the educational deficit? But they come and they're willing to risk the separation from their children for this way of life. And the United States essentially provides what, in the eyes of many, looks like foster care. They get education, they get sports training. They're either put with relatives or they're housed in facilities. Yep. In a moment, I'm going to get to Alex Azar, the HHS secretary, talking about this, because HHS has custody of these kids. Is that the bishops have often talked about the evils of separating families this way? Is there also an evil in a system that perpetuates people willingly separating themselves from families?
Sure. I mean, look, the parents bringing these kids with them, and sometimes they actually rent kids that even aren't their own to get the benefit from it. But let's assume it's parents bringing their own children. They're grown-ups. They know what they're doing. They're taking this risk because the risk paid off for years and years under Obama. We let everybody go. We still do this. I was just down in South Texas not that long ago. Catch and release. Border Patrol literally takes them to the bus station and drops them off, and they hop on the bus to go to wherever their relatives are with the kids. So the problem here is that we have created an expectation that you can get away with it if you bring a kid with you. Changing that expectation is what we're trying to do. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to stick to it. You have to be consistent. It will work, but it's not going to happen in a week or 2 weeks.
I want to play this for you. And there's a lot of concern about this. This is Alex Azar being questioned about the separation of the family unit. Watch.
Individual children are separated from their parents only when those parents cross the border illegally and are arrested. We can't have children with parents who are in incarceration and so then they're given to me. If one presents at an actual border crossing and presents a case to come into this country, one is not arrested and one's children are not separated from them.
That's for people who are applying for asylum. This is the way. This is another, frankly, loophole. If you come to a regular crossing point, a port of entry is what it's called. You wait in line, you go up to the inspector and you say, hi, I'd like to apply for asylum. we end up letting those people in.
Both the child and the
child
parent.
and the parent.
And let's face it, the word has gone out. Go seek asylum.
Years ago,
and they'll let you in.
That's what this this caravan, remember, from a few weeks ago.
Every year
That's what that was about.
Caravan.
This was the most. This was the biggest and sort of the most involved. And what we're doing is teeing up a situation that's just like what you saw in Germany a few years back. Remember where the prime minister there in Germany said, "Yeah, anybody who wants to come in, come in." They had 1 million people pour in all at once. These steps are designed to prevent that kind of out of control flow into the border. And one last point, Mexico is a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees. These people have an obligation to apply in the first country that they get to where they're not being persecuted. Every one of these people has gone 1,000 miles through Mexico, hasn't applied for asylum there. I don't think they should even be permitted to apply for asylum in the United States.
So what's the answer legislatively? Where are we now? And what, if you were writing up the legislation, what would it look like to stop this and yet keep an open heart and an open arm toward those who truly are in need of asylum? And there are people in need of asylum. I'm just not sure it's all the people we're seeing at the borders.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, if I were writing the bill, given the framework that sort of already exists, I would be happy to give green cards to the people who had the DACA amnesty from Obama. It's about 700,000 people. I don't like it. It's distasteful.
Yeah,
it's
even though the courts have said that was an illegal act by the
There's no
president,
question. But it's been, what is it now? 6
6
years,
years.
something like that.
Yeah.
And at some point, I mean, Obama left the steaming mess for the Trump administration to clean up. So you got to do that, in my opinion. Clean that up. But every amnesty incentivizes new illegal immigration. So you need to plug these loopholes that are driving much of this so-called asylum flow. You need to get border enforcement up. Some places that's going to be a wall. Other places it'll be different things. I think, and this is something that they have pretty much ruled out, they're not even talking about it, E-Verify needs to be mandated. That's an online system. So when you hire somebody, you take their Social Security information anyway. You just check online and make sure they're telling you the truth. It exists now, but it's voluntary. So then the last thing I think is essential is an offset for the amnesty in cutting legal immigration. In other words, sort of pay as you go, if you will. And so we need reductions in legal immigration, especially the chain migration, which leads to sort of people sponsoring their relatives.
And we let in, what, 1 million people a year?
1 million people
and
a year
that's
now.
legal. That's legal.
Just legal
so
immigration.
What you're asking for is if you're going to grant amnesty to 800,000 people, you deduct that from the legal rolls.
Right. And going forward, legal immigration needs to be pared back anyway. There's really no reason we should be taking 1 million people.
Well, you would have, but now to counter the argument, you would have people, and I hear them, from business to agriculture, saying, we need these workers, Mark KRIKORIAN, and Americans are not willing to do some of these jobs, so we need it. Immigrant flow is a good, healthy thing for a republic. You would say what?
Oldest cliche you hear in this business is jobs Americans won't do.
Right.
Look,
and our economy is booming, and there are more jobs, and we can't hire Americans. 50-year low in layoffs, Mark.
But what they don't tell you is that the unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for jobs. What they don't tell you is there are 50 million working-age Americans who aren't even looking for work. Now, some of those people don't want a job. They may be a mom at home taking care of their kids, what have you. But millions of those people could be drawn in because a tight labor market, in other words, where employers have trouble finding people, is the best social policy. Because because employers then say, okay, where am I going to get my workers? Let me go to the work release program at the jail, see if they're any good. Let me go to the high school. Let me go to a program for recovering addicts and see if I can help these guys get their lives together. Let me look at a program for developmentally disabled people, see if they maybe would be able to fill a slot. If you don't have to do that as an employer, why would you bother if you've got Hondurans lined up to give jobs to? But if you don't have that, then you have to start getting imaginative, and that is good for American workers.
Mark KRIKORIAN, thank you for being here. You can follow Mark's work at the Center for Immigration Studies at CIS.org. Before we go to our next guest, more news from the world over. President Donald Trump said Thursday he is ready and well prepared for his upcoming summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The president insists that it will be more than a photo op. Trump made the comments while hosting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the Oval Office. Abe requested the meeting to discuss the summit and ensure Japan's interests are represented. He said the Trump-Kim meeting is an opportunity for greater peace and stability and will be a dramatic and transformational moment for Northeastern Asia. Trump, as well, was bullish.
North Korean representatives are in Singapore right now working very hard, as are people from the United States, and it's all going along very fine. I hope it continues on this track. If it does, the world will be a very happy place.
Joining me now with analysis is Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and former Special Assistant to President Ronald Reagan, Doug Bandow. Doug, thanks for returning to the show. How significant is it that we're seeing this summit between North Korea and the United States with President Trump and Kim Jong-un at all? How significant is it?
It's a dramatic step. They talked about trying to do a summit back with President Clinton. It didn't happen. Since then, the relationship has been really in an utter deep freeze. So to have these two people meet, this is extraordinary.
Now, some are saying this will solidify Kim's rule over North Korea. Do you feel that way?
Well, what goes on in North Korea very much is internal, so we shouldn't assume that. It certainly helps him internationally. It presents him as being a serious leader. He's met with the Chinese. Putin has invited him. He's meeting with President Trump. That's very big internationally. But internally, this is a very strange place. So, you know, I wouldn't put anything past it.
Now, you were just there in the North. People don't often remember. We are still in a state of war, or on a war footing, between North and South Korea, and the United States has a serious military presence there. Do you see this ending, this summit, or the end result of it, with a declaration that that war has ended?
I think there's a good chance that's where this summit will go. You know, North and South Korea have talked about that. We have an armistice, not a treaty.
Right.
There's no peace, as you indicated. The president has talked about perhaps declaring this. The Chinese would be happy with that. So that might be one of the positive outcomes, that if we could lower those tensions, I think that would be helpful. And that might reduce some of those security concerns up north.
Former intelligence director James Clapper has called the summit a huge concession to the North Korean regime. He says it grants it legitimacy. Do you think that's a sober and right criticism?
Well, it's certainly a nice step for the North. I mean, Kim is stepping out here, and suddenly he's being accepted as a world leader. His summit with Moon showed that he's actually comfortable in the international stage. But I think there's an advantage to that. Yes, it's a concession in a sense. On the other hand, it actually shows him the benefits of playing ball, that he can come out and suddenly be recognized, perhaps have some influence, normalize his country. So it's a two-way street here. I think it's very important, and it's good for us to try to draw them out.
Now, the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, has been in North Korea, working, or in South Korea rather, working with the principals here in preparations for this summit. He said just this week, North Korea will receive relief only when it demonstrates verifiable and irreversible steps to denuclearization. Do you see that as being a reality coming out of this?
Well, what I would say is that they're likely to commit themselves to that. We're not going to see that coming out of this. This is going to take time. You know, the North Koreans are not going to give up all their leverage and then hope they get benefits out of it.
Well, can they be trusted? That's the real question. I mean, can they be trusted at all?
Well, of course not, which is why you have to set up a process of inspections. It's, in my mind, why you do step by step. We see you take a step before we give you anything. We have inspectors in there. One of the things we want is an inventory of their program, that we can go out there. How many nukes do they have? What assets do they have? We want to send in inspectors and check that.
Well, the president, part of the reason he blew up the summit the first time, a few weeks ago, was because they weren't allowing inspectors in. There was no inspection here. Will inspectors be allowed? And is it even, how do you know what you're seeing when you're dealing with a regime that is known as the Hermit Kingdom?
Well, it's going to be very hard. The estimates on nuclear weapons is anywhere between 15 and 60. You know, so they could throw a lot of these in tunnels or something. They could say, we have 20. How do we know? How do we check that? It's going to be an extremely difficult process, which is why if it happens, it'll take time.
What concessions do you think the North Koreans are going to ask of the United States going into this summit?
My guess is they're going to want to have some kind of economic relief. I think the starting point for us is a freeze, continued freeze on testing. We might want to give them something on that. You know, that's something that's easy to monitor. No nuclear tests, no missile tests. That helps at least limit the program. You know, the main thing, they may want to get U.S. troops out of there, but that's a much longer term objective. I think short term it's economic.
Yeah, and James Mattis said there's no talk of getting rid of troops. Not this round anyway. He said that's not within the realm of possibility. Senate Democrats have come up with a list of demands for North Korea. We're going to put them up on your screen. They say the deal has to include the dismantlement and removal of all nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons from North Korea. The U.S. must ensure a complete and verifiable denuclearization of the North. North Korea must end its ballistic missile program, and North Korea must comply with anywhere, anytime inspections to ensure it's not cheating on the deal, and the deal must be permanent. Are those Senate Democrats trying to set the president up for failure? This sounds like a pretty high bar.
No, this is a wish list. I mean, for example, I would say, yeah, we'd like to get to chemical and biological, but I'm worried about nuclear today. And the question is, again, a step by step. How do you make it irreversible? How do you make it verifiable? Do it step by step. Let's be realistic. The president deserves credit for having gotten this far. Let's not set an impossible objective when, in fact, we don't want the good, the perfect to be the enemy of the good.
Yeah. Last week, the president met with a high-ranking general, the number 2 to Kim Jong-un, at the White House, and he had this to say. Watch.
We're not going to go in and sign something on June 12th. We never were. We're going to start a process. And I told him today, take your time. You can go fast, we can go slowly. But I think they'd like to see something happen. And if we can work that out, that'd be good. But the process will begin on June 12th in Singapore.
What kind of process do you foresee, Doug Bandow?
I assume that what they're thinking of is a general commitment to denuclearization of the type that we have talked about, and then set up some goals and set up a regular negotiating system in which we're going to start moving toward that, where we recognize we expect to see continuing progress. That's going to be sending inspectors in. That means we want an inventory. That's going to several things, but we'll have to offer something in return as well.
As so often happens with this president, conventional wisdom ends up getting blown up in people's faces. And when that letter dropped, when President Trump wrote the letter and said, we're ending the summit, but my phone is here, call me if you reconsider, but you're too aggressive and I don't like the terms of this thing. People were saying, look at this crazy man. I was on the radio that day and I said, you know what? Stand back for a moment, take your emotions, your hatred or love of Donald Trump out of this. Might this be a negotiating tactic? Your thoughts on that decision by the president to blow up the first version of this summit?
Well, my guess is it didn't change the outcome dramatically, but what it may have done is send a message that the U.S. is prepared to walk away. And that is the important thing. People have worried that the president might be too desiring of having a win of some sort. It's important to communicate to the North Koreans we don't accept just anything, but in fact the president is prepared to say no if he doesn't think it's a good deal.
Some are saying the president may be falling into a trap here in that the North Koreans might be trying to lure the United States into a protracted peace process that buys them time to make other alliances and to strengthen the regime. Is that a possibility?
I would look at it as compared to what? That is, a military option is really not an option. I mean, we cannot afford to trigger a war in South Korea. It'd be horrendous. General Mattis and others have talked about how horrific it would be. So the point is we don't have many good options. So to my mind, what we see is if we can at least get some steps like halting testing, if we can draw them out where they see the benefits, if we can get support from China, there are things that I think move us forward where they're going to be no better off than they would have been otherwise, and I think we may be moving forward in a way we didn't have a chance before.
You mentioned China. What role have they played? It seems the president has kind of triangulated North Korea, using Japan, using China, the South Koreans certainly. What is the role of China? Some have sat in that chair and told me, we're really not dealing with North Korea, we're dealing with China. That is the puppet master for the North Korean puppet.
I simply don't believe that. If you look historically at North Korea, it has long played China against Russia. It's been resiliently independent. It does not like to be dominated. I think they want us there in some sense to play off of China. So China's been very frustrated. I think China wants to have a kind of a compliant puppet, and they don't have that. They want a buffer against the United States.
But they're very reliant on China for their economy, trade. It's one of the few partners they have in the world.
But realize from the standpoint of China, you don't want to blow up North Korea. Imagine the United States and Mexico. Would you want to blow up that regime, loose nuclear weapons, factional fighting, millions of refugees? And they don't want to have a reunification that is on American terms with U.S. troops on their border. So they want that buffer. So they've always been very concerned, how much pressure do we put on, but they don't like a buffer that's causing trouble, which is what the North is doing. So they've kind of had that both ways of how far do we go.
Well, what do you think the Chinese want from this June 12th summit?
They'd like to lower the temperature. They'd like to have military means put off the map. They'd like to see the North move towards some kind of denuclearization. They'd like to see the U.S. and South Korea move towards a peace agreement with the North. They'd be happy with that. From their standpoint, then they'd have a lot of investment in the North, a good relationship, but you wouldn't have all that instability and worry.
And you think Trump is using the possibility of trade, opening this market up? Will that be a lure, a powerful one for Kim Jong-un?
It appears to be. Kim Jong-un, in contrast to his father, seems to care a lot about economic development. And I think this is something he understands, that for his country to be an important country, it needs economic growth. It needs to have that kind of prosperity. I think that's something that is drawing him out.
Doug Bandow, thank you for being here.
Happy to be on.
For your
Absolutely.
insights. You can follow Doug Bandow's commentary at cato.org. Before we go to our next guest, some news for you. Pope Francis has rejected the German bishop's proposal to allow Protestant spouses who are married to Catholics to receive the Eucharist. In a letter to Cardinal Reinhard Marx, president of the German Bishops' Conference, Cardinal-elect Luis Ladaria, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, said the German proposal raises a series of problems of considerable importance. Among them, a letter cited Canon 844 of church law, which reads that the sacraments be licitly administered to Catholic members of the Christian faithful alone, who likewise receive them licitly from Catholic ministers alone. The letter also cited that communion in interfaith marriages would impact ecumenical relations, and that it is also a topic that touches the faith of the Church and has relevance for the universal Church. And in the U.S., a big religious liberty victory at the Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision on Monday. The High Court ruled that the First Amendment rights of a Colorado baker who refused to make a wedding cake for a gay couple were violated by the state. Bakery owner Jack Phillips spoke about the victory on NBC's Today Show.
The United States Supreme Court has decided that we can try and enter the wedding business again and realize that I serve everybody, and it's just that I don't create cakes for every occasion that people ask me to create. A wedding cake is a wedding is an inherently religious event, and the cake is definitely a specific message that goes with that.
The decision is narrow in that the court did not rule on whether or not a business can invoke religious objections to refuse service to gay or lesbian people. Other such cases are making their way through the courts. Justice Anthony Kennedy said in his majority opinion that the issue must await further elaboration. And on Monday, the High Court vacated a lower court decision that allowed an illegal immigrant teen to seek an abortion while in federal custody. Last September, the Trump administration would not transport or release a 17-year-old girl so she could obtain an abortion, citing its policy that the administration does not facilitate abortions for pregnant minors in its shelters. The American Civil Liberties Union stepped in, sued, and won a court decision, claiming the girl had a right under the U.S. Constitution to obtain an abortion, and that the Trump administration was blocking her right. The justices did not rule any further on the matter. They will hear arguments in a similar case in September. Currently, the federal government is barred from blocking such abortions. Joining me now with analysis is Director of the Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, Carter SNEAD. Professor Carter SNEAD, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
Look, I want to talk first about the Vatican's Bambino Yaesu clinic that really is known around the world for their great work. This week they issued a new charter on the rights of what they call incurable children. This is, of course, in the wake of the Alfie Evans case, the Charlie Gard case, where the EU and British courts determined the fate of those children. Tell me how important this charter is now and what it means.
Well, it's certainly an important symbolic gesture on the part of the Vatican and the hospital there at the Vatican. The Vatican and Pope Francis himself and the folks at Bambino Gesu were extraordinarily powerful and prophetic voices in both the cases of Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans on behalf of not just children, but children who are disabled, and a voice against the sort of voices that argued against tolerance of imperfection and those who wanted to make quality of life the benchmark for who lives and who dies. It was a great and proud moment for the church, although a sad result. And this follows on to those interventions, and it's a wonderful statement of principle by the hospital. Of course, it doesn't have any legal force, or it wouldn't have any legal meaning in the courts of the United Kingdom, but it's a very valuable prophetic intervention. And
I'm going to run down some of the rights that they delineate. There are 10 articles. Among them are children with terminal diseases have the right to second opinions, the right to better diagnostic and palliative care, the right to experimental treatments and drugs, and the right to seek care across international borders. Your thoughts on, could this have some impact, given the global attention on these particular cases and the Pope and the Vatican's outreach to the parents in both these cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those provisions that you're talking about and the others as well really come down to the proposition that children, even children who are gravely ill, even children who will die soon, are entitled to not just the protection of the law, but the care of physicians, the genuine care of physicians, and that no one should abandon these children because some stranger has decided that their quality of life has fallen below an idealized threshold. That really, a lot of people don't understand. There were so many bad things about the Gard and Evans cases, obviously the issue involving parental authority and parental rights and the role of the state. But even more deeply, there were grave problems in that case where the court was animated by a kind of opposition to people with disabilities. They concluded that because the child could not recover, in both cases, could not recover an idealized level of cognitive functioning, it would be illegal to extend that child's life. They declared the life to be a life not worth living and put the force and coercive power of the law behind it. This is a counterweight to that. This is an argument about the dignity of children, and all people, even though they might be very seriously ill or disabled or suffering. We don't abandon them. They're entitled to treatment. They're entitled to care, including palliative care. And palliative care in the real sense, in the sense of providing comfort, not in the sense of withdrawing their life-sustaining measures in order to hasten their death.
I want to ask you about a related story. Gallup is releasing results of a new poll, and it turns out, it indicates that Americans still believe that abortion is morally wrong. At least 48% of them believe that. 43% believe it is morally acceptable. How do you read those results? What do you think is happening culturally?
Well, culturally, I like to think, and I think there's some evidence to support this, that people are coming to the realization that the child in the womb is not only biologically, but morally, and as a matter of basic justice, a member of the human family. And we see that through the great wonders of technology, 4D ultrasound, seeing the faces of these children. Fetal surgery helps us to understand that these children are patients. They're not mere blobs of tissue. They're not merely the object of a choice, some abstract object of choice. I think that has an effect. And I'd like to know more about the empirical findings. I'd like to know how the question was phrased. I'd like to know what people had in mind when they were answering those questions. But my sense, and certainly the sense that I get here at the University of Notre Dame with the young people, especially the young people that interact with the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, that young people intuitively grasp that everybody counts, and that a law that excludes a segment of the human family from its protection or our moral concern is an unjust law, and that has to change.
I got to get to this before I let you go. This week, a big story, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith issuing a letter that they've written to the German bishops, which would not allow Protestant spouses of Catholics to receive communion, even if they believe in the sacrament, which was the wish of the German bishops. Your thoughts on this as a teaching for the universal church? Had this been allowed, had the German bishops been allowed to sort of go their own way and grant this right to communion to those who aren't Catholic, it would have absolutely had an effect on the global church and those within it.
Well, again, this is beyond the ken of my expertise. I'm not a theologian, but my layperson's reaction to that is that it stands in relation and is something that we can be proud of alongside Pope Francis's interventions in the Gard and Evans cases. In those cases, Pope Francis stood up in a way that no one else did, and it sounds like he made the judgment that this is a line that shouldn't be crossed. And as the leader of our church and the Holy Father, I think we should take that very seriously.
Yeah, very good. Carter Snead, thank you as always for your insights. We'll check back in with you soon.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Finally tonight, it's time to get story-oriented. She's a New York Times best-selling children's author. She's here tonight to talk about writing, telling great stories, and her latest work, Grump, the fairly true tale of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Joining me now from Chicago is LIESL SHURTLIFF. LIESL, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, Grump is your fourth foray into classic fairy tales. You kind of turn them on their ears a little bit. What drew you to mining these classic fairy tales? This is not the first book you've written in this series.
No, it's the fourth, and fairy tales have always been a part of my childhood. I was always really drawn to them as a child. My grandmother actually gave me my first copy of Grimm's fairy tales, and I just devoured those stories. And when I grew up and I started writing, I really hadn't intended to write fairy tales at first, but I think I just kind of kept coming back to them. And I think my subconscious kind of led me back to them, knowing that that was really where I had a lot of creativity to mine. So it's just something that I've always been really passionate about.
Before I get deeply into the book, you dedicate Grump to your 7 siblings, which is appropriate. This is, after all, the Seven Dwarves and Snow White. Do you use your family as archetypes for your characters?
I use them for bits and pieces of them and their personalities as for characters and even situations and dialogue. I hesitate to say, you know, this sibling is this character and that sibling is that character.
Oh, I'm sure they can tell.
Because, you know, who knows how they're going to feel about that. They might be able to tell a little bit, but I never make it too specific, or at least I never admit.
Yeah, that's smart. You see, never tell them, LIESL, never tell them. Even I've gotten a few calls about characters, and I go, oh, no, there's no relation at all to you. I just move on. Why Grumpy? Why hitch an entire book on Grumpy and that particular dwarf? And where did the name Borland come from, which you reveal as his true name in this book?
Well, Borland is actually a character, and the origin of the story comes from my last book, Red, the fairly true tale of Red Riding Hood. She meets this dwarf named Borland. He is rather grumpy, and in the course of conversation, Snow White comes up, and he calls Snow White a spoiled brat. And it kind of took me off guard as I wrote that. It was kind of like this character took over, and I started to wonder what this tale would look like from a dwarf's point of view. They're kind of a more marginalized, you know, characters that are just kind of set to the side, and we don't get a whole lot from them. Now, Grumpy in particular, that's a Disney character. That's a licensed character. He's not, you know, he's not that character. I make a nod to that because that's what everyone knows. Kids are reading this story, and when they think of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, they think of the Disney story. But actually, in the original Grimm's version, they don't have names at all. They're just referred to as first, second, third, fourth. Just numbers and
generic elf number 4.
You know, as a collective. Exactly. So I really wanted, you know, and I think Disney kind of took that a step further, and they individualized them a little bit, but I wanted to even take it further and really give them names and histories and backgrounds and just give them a little bit more dignity.
Yeah, well, we really discovered that there's an entire world that these dwarves occupy that you really don't think about. And here they're chomping on rubies, and I love the way that you've kind of cross-pollinated all these books. And my daughters read Red and Jack. And what you've done is they are standalone tales, but there is some cross-pollination. As you mentioned, this character appeared in Red, and Jack and Red have a connection. Tell me about that network, if you will, of characters. Was that something premeditated or something that you stumbled on as you wrote one story and the next?
I have to admit, it's something I more stumbled upon, but I think it actually comes about really naturally with fairy tales because they share so many common themes and threads between the stories themselves. Even in the original Snow White tale, there's a spot that actually connects with Goldilocks, and there's lots of themes of gold and treasure in these stories. Princesses in towers are asleep. So there's just a lot of crossover between the fairy tales themselves anyway. So as I was writing them, I would find those little connections. And when I found them, I would kind of milk them for all they were worth. And it just had a lot of fun doing it. But I always allowed it to come about naturally. And never wanted it to be forced, the connection between the stories. So it was all very organic, for sure.
What do you want kids and their parents to come away with from this particular book, the fourth book in this series, Grump?
I think first and foremost, whenever I'm writing a story for children, I just really hope that the kids first will want to read it, that they'll find it to be a really enjoyable book that shows them that reading can be really fun and not a chore. In terms of overall message or lessons, I don't think about that too hard while I'm writing, but I do hope that they think about point of view. That changing the point of view of anyone's story changes the story, and you get different lessons and different things from that. And also, these fairy tales are awesome stories, and there's just a lot to mine there. And I hope that they'll look at the original fairy tales as well and kind of compare and contrast. So it's really fun to see how they've changed over time.
Yeah, and I love how you've slotted these stories. They're almost extra canonical. They fit within the flow of the other stories, but kind of fill in the blanks and enlarge them a bit around the edges and humanize these characters in a way we haven't seen before. So I know I've seen kids respond particularly to this series, so I know it works. Now, you studied music and dance and theater at Brigham Young University. How did that shape your writing life?
Oh, it shaped my writing life hugely. Some people say, "Oh, do you feel like you wish you would have majored in writing or creative writing or something?" And I really feel like theater, especially for children's writing, was the perfect way to study story and character arc, character objective. In my acting classes, we were constantly, being hounded about what is it that your character wants. You have to know, and that's really going to shape the character development and how the scene feels. And so I'm constantly thinking about that in my writing as well. What is it that my character wants? How are they going to get it? What's working against them? So the same kinds of principles really apply. And I also feel like, musicals, I feel like that form has sort of informed my writing as well, that they kind of have a cheesy kind of musical theater quality that I think works great for fairy tales and great for kids.
No, they're fun. They're fun. Now, tell me, you wrote in a blog entry once, and I'm going to pull this on you here. It was called A Fear in Faith, and you said your faith is something that deeply affects your writing in process and content. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think I often hear a lot of people say that they really want to write a book, that they have all these ideas, which to me means that they have really good intention but no drive to actually put it into practice. And I think that can really go back to faith, religious practice, and belief. We can believe things, but if we don't actually put those beliefs into practice, what good are they? And I kind of feel the same way about creativity and ideas. If you have lots of creative ideas and they're constantly spinning in your head, that's great. But if you don't do anything with them, then they're not benefiting anyone else, and they're not benefiting you. So, and honestly, I think when we're writing, it is a process of faith. You don't always know how things are going to turn out. You have this idea and you really like it, and you have hope that it will be something good, but you don't know what it's going to look like in the end. And so, to me, any creative process is an act of faith.
A walk of faith, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have to ask you some questions that I ask every author who sits on this particular segment. Your favorite children's book is what and why?
My favorite children's book, it's really hard to pick just one, but I'm going to go with Matilda by Roald Dahl. And he's an author that has hugely affected my writing, and he really affected my childhood as a reader, especially that book, Matilda. When I read that book, it really inspired me to be a reader. As I read it, I started to really believe that reading was a powerful thing, and that it could change us, and it could change the way that we think and how we think about ourselves. So I love Matilda.
That's a beautiful book. No, I've read it to my daughter several times. I love Roald Dahl. I love that you said that. His adult writing, by the way, is also a little more racy, but great. Your least favorite children's book or book, and why? I'm not going to say a children's book. Okay, that's okay.
But can I say a book that I did not particularly care for?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
So I did not love Wuthering Heights.
Oh.
That book I just did not care for it, which is interesting because I really loved Jane Eyre. It's actually one of my favorite books.
Wow.
But, Wuthering Heights just, no.
Heathcliff didn't do it for you. Okay. Which story helped you to find your own path, and the one life lesson that you remember from it?
Oh, which story helped me to find my own path and the life lesson? I don't necessarily know about path so much, but something a book that altered my point of view, my way of thinking, is The Lemon Tree by Sandy Tolan. And it's a nonfiction book. This is not children's. But I recommend it to all adults. And it's a book about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And he really takes it to a very human level of an Arab man and a Jewish woman, and a very unlikely friendship that they form, and talking and discussing the conflict there. And it gives a lot of history, and it really, really changed the way I feel about, well, first it just informed me. I really did not know very much about that conflict, at least the history. And it just really brought more understanding. And I think that let me know how important it is to study history, and to get also a personal story about whatever has gone on or is going on. I think personal stories, telling our story, and then listening to other people's story is so important. So all storytelling, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I think is a really powerful thing.
I agree. Where do you write, LIESL, and why?
I write anywhere that I know I'm not going to be interrupted, and that's moderately quiet. You know that I have 4 children, and that can be kind of chaotic sometimes. So I'm often leaving the house, and I will write in my church building, actually, sometimes. And or I'll go to a cafe and write in a cafe, because I know no one's going to interrupt me there and ask me to brush their teeth or whatever.
Or help them with the homework. I'm a big fan of cafes too. They're not a big fan of me, but I frequent those. If you could pick a writing mentor,
I try to order something.
Yeah, well, that's good. Me too. Yeah, I'm not in for that new Starbucks policy where you can go in but not order anything. If you could pick a writing mentor, dead or alive, who would it be?
Charles Dickens.
Ah, the great
I
Charles
think
Dickens.
he's just brilliant. He creates the most incredible characters. Him or Lewis Carroll, because he's just wacky.
Yeah, he is wacky. And his characters are memorable in their own way, but they're not Dickens. Advice to parents who want to get their children to read, particularly to reluctant readers, what would you say to them?
Well, first I would say read to them. And I really think that's the gateway to becoming a reader, is to be read to. And that was really, that was the beginning for me. My mom read to me. I loved the read aloud at school. That was it's just so wonderful. Get them to fall in love with stories. And then read with them as they read, as they grow in their reading, continue, take turns. And so make it a slow process. I think that sometimes we're so eager to make our children independent readers that as soon as they can read, we're like, okay, now you're on your own. But it should be a bonding time for a long time. And I read, I still read to my kids, even though they're all but the baby. They're all very independent readers, but we still enjoy reading together. And so I think if you make that a part of your family and a part of your life, that they'll become readers themselves. Also, just give them a lot of choice. They're not going to they're not all going to love the same books, and they might not love the books that you love. But that's okay. I think just giving them a lot of choice is really key to becoming a reader.
There's nothing like a family sharing a story. That's why I love audiobooks as well as when they read to one another, because then they can discuss the stumbling blocks, the challenges, the confusions, and the bursts of light that happen while they're encountering that story. I agree with you. Final question. Game of Thrones author George Martin always says authors are either architects or gardeners. Which are you, LIESL?
I'm a gardener.
A gardener. What does that mean to you?
I'm not sure what that means exactly, but it seems to resonate. I think of stories as things that are grown, and I start with a very small seed, and I don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. I don't have a grand plan usually beforehand. I just have this little tiny idea that keeps pulsing and keeps growing, and then I'm planting more seeds, and some of them turn into little flowers, and some of them turn into trees. So that idea seems to resonate more with me than being an architect. That sounds
much too rigid
really,
and controlling.
difficult.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like to think we're a little bit of both.
That's the word.
Good. Thank you so much, LIESL, for being here. And the book is Grump, The Fairly True Tale of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves by LIESL SHURTLIFF. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online. You middle grade readers will love it. LIESL, thanks. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much, Raymond.
That is all the time we have for now until next week. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.